What if the scariest thing isn't the shadows in the dark or the noises in the night, but the unsettling truth that some things just can't be explained? Imagine this. You've moved into what seems like a normal apartment, nothing fancy, nothing too strange. But then the footsteps start. Not from the floor above you, mind you, but from the ceiling, as if someone is walking above you, pacing the room, step by slow step. Sounds insane, right? Like something straight out of a horror movie. But what if I told you this was a true story? Not a spooky urban legend, not some ghost story shared over beers, but a real experience that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around you. Most people would brush it off as a prank or a draft. But what if it's not? What if it's a warning? A sign of something older, darker something waiting for you to notice it? And what if, just by paying attention, you can uncover a truth that most will never understand? Stay with me as I tell you about footsteps on the ceiling, because this is more than just an eerie tale. It was a complex that had seen better days. What had once been a noble estate built in the 1970s or 1980s had faded into a relic of the past, its walls sagging under the weight of the years and the uneven terrain on which it sat. The area also had a history, one that could never be ignored. This land, before the building rose from it, had been home to Native American tribes. And this was no ordinary land. This was a land soaked in skirmishes, loss, and death. As a result, there were always whispers among the locals about the strange things that happened there. But to John, it was home. It was just an apartment. He had no reason to believe the place was anything more than a simple living space. At first, he lived in the middle section of the building, on the second floor, close to the management office. It was an unremarkable apartment, familiar, quiet, save for the persistent mouse problem that kept him company. That, however, was something he could live with, at least until the day he saw the roach. It was that moment, just that one horrifying moment, that broke him. No more. He had to get out. The ladies in the office were understanding, offering him a new apartment at the other end of the building. It was a corner unit on the third floor, and to John, it was the perfect upgrade. He had always wanted the top floor, away from the sounds of neighbors above him. No more footsteps overhead, no more squeaks and creaks. Just peace. Settling into the new apartment, everything seemed perfect at first. No mice, no roaches. He'd gotten a fresh start, and the quiet was welcome. But as the days wore on, things started to feel off. He and his partner, who was now his wife, noticed it at night. It started slowly. They'd hear footsteps above them. At first, it seemed like a normal enough noise, the kind of sounds an old building makes when the temperature shifts and the wood expands. But as the days passed, it grew more distinct, more deliberate. Every night, without fail, they'd hear footsteps. And not just from one part of the apartment to another, but footsteps that seemed to follow them. It wasn't just random noise. The footsteps followed them from the bedroom to the living room, stepping in rhythm, circling the room, as if whatever or whoever was above them was pacing. There was a feeling to it, a strange, unnerving sensation that never quite left them. Like they weren't alone in the space, like someone was quietly trailing their every movement. John's mind went into overdrive. Could someone be hiding in the attic? It was a possibility, but then the questions began to pile up. Why would they be in the attic of all places? And why would they choose to make themselves known like this? If someone were hiding up there, wouldn't they try to remain as quiet as possible? The sounds didn't make sense. It wasn't the neighbors either. The noise came from directly above them, and not just from above, but from within their own apartment. The footsteps didn't seem to come from the ceiling. They felt closer, almost as though someone were pacing on the walls or the floor itself, just beyond the threshold of the living room. And then there was the eerie pattern. Every time they settled in for the night, whether it was in the bedroom or the living room, they'd hear the footsteps. They'd always circle the room in the same way, always pacing with a determined rhythm before they would stop and settle. It was almost as if the presence, whatever it was watching them, waiting for them to finish their routines. It was there when they fell asleep, and it was there when they woke up. John, ever the skeptic but open to the unusual, began to form an unsettling conclusion. His apartment, he believed, was haunted. He mentioned it to his partner, but she didn't share his excitement or his fear. She believed in spirits, certainly, but didn't engage with them unless they posed a direct threat. She would rather ignore them altogether, preferring to live her life without acknowledging what lurked in the unseen corners. John, on the other hand, had always been drawn to the supernatural. He had an uncanny ability to sense things, sometimes seeing glimpses of the past or catching flashes of the future. There was even a time when he almost entered the priesthood, contemplating a life dedicated to exorcism. He didn't believe in the traditional sense of spirits. No, for him, the world was full of unseen forces, entities, and phenomena. And now he was certain there was something in that apartment, something malevolent, and it wasn't going anywhere. In his mind's eye, he saw him clearly, a white man in his mid to late 20s. He was disheveled, his beard thick and unkempt, wearing a flannel shirt and faded blue jeans. John could almost feel the man's presence, a weight that pressed on the space around him. This entity wasn't just walking around. No, he was following them, circling. The spirit, or whatever it was, seemed to be attached to them, pacing on the ceiling, moving upside down as though it were nothing more than a reflection of normality. And then there was the worst part. The man never left. He would settle, always cross-legged, staring at John and his partner as they went about their lives. Sitting still, watching them in their most vulnerable moments, whether they were lying on the couch watching TV or eating dinner. He was there, silently observing, never leaving. But the disturbances didn't stop there. One night, as John lay in his bed, trying to relax after a long day, he felt it. At first, it was subtle, just a slight trembling beneath him, like the faint vibration of a passing train miles away. But it didn't stop. The bed shook harder, then harder still. John's mind raced. A train? No, he would have felt that much earlier. Was it something else? A pinched nerve, maybe? He adjusted himself, shifting his body into a more neutral position. But the shaking continued, stronger now, unequivocally real. He sat up, panic creeping into his chest. What was happening? He knew the only way to confront this was to pray, so he did. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The words felt cold in his mouth as he recited the prayer, his voice trembling. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, the shaking stopped. But only for a second, then it resumed harder, more aggressive. He could feel the bed rattling beneath him, as if it were being shaken by unseen hands. Panicked, he reached for his phone and called his partner. She didn't hesitate for a second. She was coming back to him. The fear in John's chest began to ease with the promise of her presence. But then she told him about her night. The door to her bedroom wouldn't open. It was locked, yes, but not in the usual way. The knob wouldn't turn, no matter how much she pushed. The door stayed shut, as though it were being held from the other side. Her grandmother had to come to the rescue, and when she laid hands on the door, it finally gave way, as though something had released its hold on it. The timing was too perfect. It happened right when John's bed was shaking. The two experiences were connected, he knew it. And now, with his partner by his side, he could finally breathe again. But the question still lingered. What was this thing? Why was it watching them? The night was quieter with his partner beside him. John finally found a moment to breathe, though his mind was still racing. His partner's grandmother had told her nothing at all, when she'd returned from work that night. She just seemed to be waiting. But for what? They hadn't even talked about the eerie coincidence. And when his partner came to him, her grandmother just gave her a look that told her everything she needed to know, without a single word being spoken. John couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this entity was, it wasn't finished with them. In the days that followed, things started to feel even more oppressive. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore, though they still echoed through the walls, ever present, but it was the sense of something else, something lingering just out of sight. The air grew heavier, thicker, like walking through a fog that refused to lift. It was as though the building itself had become a trap, holding something back, something that had no intention of letting them go. They tried to go on with their lives. Their routines returned to some semblance of normalcy, but even their daily activities felt hollow, as though the presence above them was always watching, always aware. The footsteps, the pacing, it never stopped. And no matter how many times they tried to ignore it, the sensation was undeniable. But it wasn't until one cold afternoon, when John came home from work, that something else happened. He had always felt that eerie sense of being watched when he entered the apartment, but today, the air felt different. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The silence was suffocating. His partner was out, and the place was unusually still. It was almost as if the whole apartment was holding its breath. John moved cautiously through the rooms, the same feeling creeping up his spine. That same feeling of eyes on him, invisible yet unmistakable. He went into the kitchen, his footsteps muffled by the soft carpet as he rummaged through the cupboards for a snack. And then he froze. It was the sound. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time not above him, but right behind him. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no one there. The sound came again, closer now, louder. He could almost feel the vibration of each step through the floor. Someone or something was walking in the room with him, moving just out of his line of sight. John swallowed hard, his throat dry. This wasn't like before. This wasn't just the pacing above. This was something in his space. Hello? His voice cracked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. No response. But the sound kept coming. And this time, he could hear it more clearly, slow, deliberate footsteps following him, matching his movements as he took a step toward the hallway. It was the worst feeling he had ever experienced. The kind of cold, penetrating dread that gnawed at your soul, like an animal clawing its way into your chest. John stepped back, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of life or any sign of what was lurking just beyond his vision. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence. John waited, his muscles tensed, ready to bolt. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears. But it was the silence that was worse. The absence of sound was almost worse than the noise itself. It was as if whatever was in the room with him had paused, waiting, calculating its next move. Suddenly, he heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a whisper. Soft at first, like a breath of air brushing against his ear, but then it grew louder, clearer. Leave. John's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but it was there, right beside him, as if it were speaking from inside his own head. He recoiled, stumbling backward, his hand clutching at the kitchen counter for support. His mind raced. What was this thing? And what did it want from him? The whispered word echoed in his mind as he stood there in the dark kitchen, unable to move. Leave. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The sensation of being surrounded by something ancient, something bound to this place, was overwhelming. As if on cue, his partner returned home, her presence breaking the tension in the air. The oppressive silence lifted the moment she entered the apartment, but John could feel the shift. Something had changed. Something was angry. I don't want to stay here anymore, John admitted that night, his voice steady but strained. He couldn't ignore it anymore, the footsteps, the whispers, the way the place seemed to breathe with its own malignant energy. His partner, still reluctant to engage with the spirit world, agreed to leave the apartment. She wasn't exactly frightened, but she could feel it too now. The air had thickened, and their routines had been interrupted long enough. Something had been unleashed. They moved out that week with little fanfare. The complex had become a place of energy, unwelcoming, almost hostile. John had never believed in ghosts before, but now he was sure of it. The apartment was haunted, not by a mere spirit, but by something ancient, something tied to the land, to the history of the building, and perhaps something much darker than he had ever imagined. As they left, John glanced back at the apartment building one last time. There, in the window of the corner unit, he could have sworn he saw the faintest outline of a man, his form barely visible, standing still. He couldn't make out his face, but the feeling, the heavy, cold feeling, was unmistakable. He shivered, turning away. And that was the last time John ever set foot in that place.